Okay, so in this video, we're going to get into a real world example of, mastering, your tools and how it relates to your actual music production program. So like I was explaining to you before, each insert, it has to somehow go to the master, whether that be like the actual individual insert, or if you create like a subgroup where you route multiple sounds to like, let's say one insert, and then you route those, to the subgroup, and then that subgroup goes to the master. Again, that one slider would affect multiple inserts. So at the end of the day, these sounds have to go to the master, and that's what you call your 2-bus, okay? And as you can see on the master track, this is it. So again, when you're mixing, you can be way more aggressive on your EQ and compression settings, but when you are actually mastering your music, let's say we open up like an EQ here, and again, I'm just using these third-party plugins. I like them for workflow. In terms of sound, it's not so much the sound. Like nowadays with digital plugins, you can be achieving like the same sound out of, pretty much any, compressor plugin. It's just for workflow. Like for example, like on here, I can create like a band and you can actually solo out the frequencies. Now, FabFilter is expensive, but it was a good purchase for myself. I've used these tools for so long now and I just like their workflow. Now, what I was trying to say is when we are gonna actually, master our music and, when you're actually mixing and mastering your own music, it's a little bit different than if you're going to send it off to a mastering engineer, because if that person is going to master your music, they've never heard your music before, okay? This is the first time they're hearing your mix. So when they listen to it right away, they might be like, ooh, maybe it needs some more brightness. So, maybe we need to put like a little high shelf in there or whatever, right? But when you've actually mixed your music, when you mixed it, like you thought it sounded good. So when it comes to the mastering stage, it's like, do you even need to have EQ on there or like compression or whatever, right? Because if you've already mixed it, you thought it sounded good, well, is the song not good now? And I'm just speaking that way because, again, if you're sending it off to a mastering engineer and they listen to your music for the first time, when they have, their critical thinking towards your music, their mindset and decisions might be different than you who's mixed your music. And that's why sending it off to a mastering engineer is typically common within the industry because, again, it's just that fresh set of ears and, stuff like that. So again, when you're mastering your own music, let's say you are going to, apply some EQ or whatever. So, again, we're talking, subtle boosts, like 1 dB can be getting aggressive. I'm going to go to a more zoomed in scale because this kind of gives you a little bit of a better reference in a sense of like, ooh, maybe that's actually kind of a big boost. Whereas if it's on like a really zoomed out scale, it's like, oh, well, that's not a big boost at all, right? But if we go to like 3 decibels, it's like, okay, I can see. So 1 decibel could be getting quite aggressive in mastering. You're looking at like 0.25 or 0.5, for example. So in other words, like half a decibel. And many times you're also on like wide cues because wide cues can kind of sound natural. And then again, same with like the compression, okay? So if I open up like a compressor here, so, again, when we're actually going to dial in our compressor settings, again, as you can see right here, I'm at 1.15 to 1. That is my, kind of starting point. And then again, it's really important that you're turning the plugin off and on just for a fair volume comparison, because how do you know if you're benefiting your music if it's not a fair comparison? And in the case of like FabFilter, it's a matter of just turning the plugin off and on here, or if you're using like the Fruity Parametric Eq2, I'll bring that up for you guys since this is about FL Studio. So this is the Fruity Parametric EQ2. You can also expand this if you want like a bigger size or whatever. So let's say, we boost it up here a little bit and you can use your scroll wheel to make the cue wider or narrower. So we'll make it a little wider. So again, since I boosted, I may just kind of reduce that volume a little bit. And then I'll make it smaller so I can actually see it this way. I like to always be able to see my effects so I can turn it off and on. So again, we boosted, we reduced a little bit. Now I would turn it off and on to see is that actually benefiting my music? In the case of like, let's say I felt I needed a little bit more highs, kind of low, mid highs. Okay. Now another reason why I might use like EQ is maybe like let's say to add some brightness into the song. So let's say I had a reference track going on. So I'm comparing my mix to one of my favorite tracks, let's say. And, I go to play my mix, I play the reference track, and instantly I hear it's like, ooh, that reference track sounds way more balanced, sounds brighter, my mix, let's just say, sound really dull. So in other words, not, the high ends could be boosted. So instead of going to each individual sound, opening up an EQ and using like a high shelf, this is where in mastering, I might have a high shelf here, and something you want to be careful of. Sorry, I'll delete that. So I'll click on it, delete it. So something you want to be careful of is as you are boosting. So if I boost at, let's say 4,000 hertz, it's pretty close to 4,000 hertz. You're also increasing frequencies below 4,000 hertz too. As you can see, it's almost going down to 1,000 hertz where we're getting some boost. Again, it's just something to be aware of. And if you adjust like the Q, I can even go further back. So as you can see, it's going all the way back to 500. Again, this is really, really subtle. We're on a really zoomed in scale. This is like, we're at like almost 1 decibel, but as you can see up here, it's up to 1 pretty much, and then down here, it's quite little. But this is where I may use a high shelf if I want some more brightness out of the whole song, okay? Because again, in mastering, you're affecting all the instruments and everything that's going on, so you have to be very, very careful in your compression and EQ kind of settings, okay? So let's just delete this. Now, I just want to talk about as you're actually mixing your music. So sometimes what people do is on the actual master track, they will actually apply a compressor, okay? And as they're mixing their music, they will actually have a compressor on the mix bus. Now, when you're dealing with a mastering engineer, many times they'll say, like if you're going to send your music to them, they'll say like, I want your export with no effects on the master track, and I want it to be like -6 or like -3 for like your max peak. I'll cover that later once we talk about like the exporting and stuff like that. But this is kind of a little hidden kind of secret within the industry, is because a compressor is kind of like an automatic volume knob. So in other words, if something gets too loud, it'll turn it down, okay? And so when we're actually mixing our music, we can actually be mixing into this compressor because, again, this is on the master track, and every single insert has to go to the master. Again, whether that be the individual insert or like a subgroup or whatever, even like the sends. As you can see, they're all going to the master. So when we're sending all this audio into the master, we can kind of help glue that mix together by mixing into a compressor. And as you can see, my setting is extremely light. So, my threshold's quite low, but my ratio is pretty low, and I also have a pretty long attack. So in other words, I'm still allowing all like those kind of transients through. This is just kind of riding the waveform. It's kind of just making it a little bit more consistent. And again, I just mix into this. Now, once I get into the mastering stage, I may tweak this totally different, but it's just, as you're mixing your track, it's just kind of nice to mix into something like this. Again, it's just kind of like a little hidden secret within the industry, and it just helps glue your mix together in a sense of, your loud parts, your quiet parts. It kind of evens it out just a little bit for you. It's kind of like cheating a little bit, instead of trying to achieve like the perfect mix between, when you're adjusting all this stuff, it kind of does a little bit of like the hard lifting for you, just subtly, right? Now, let's just talk about the mastering chain here and different tools you have available to you, okay? So you have a compressor, okay, which is just the FabFilter Pro C. That's what's called a single band compressor. There's a Fruity Band multi-band compressor. It just looks like this, and how it works is there's just different bands, okay? So the best way I can explain this to you is using the FabFilter Pro Q. So this is an EQ, but I'm going to explain to you how like a multi-band compressor works. So I'm just going to create a band here, and I'm just going to go bell, okay? I'll create another band and another band. Okay, we'll do this. So we actually have 3 bands here. I'll just kind of dip this one just so you can see them. Okay, so how a multi-band compressor works is it actually splits, different sections of your song into different bands. Okay, so as you can see, this low end would be from like, 0 all the way up to maybe, let's say, around 200. And then there's what's called a crossover. So for example, if I open up the FabFilter Pro MB, and if I just, open one band and another band, you can see right here, this is what's called a crossover, okay? And sometimes this crossover, if even on speakers, for example, you have like your high-end speaker, for example, like your tweeter, and I mean high-end by high frequencies, and then you have like your actual woofer, right? And on these speakers, you know, there's what's called a crossover. And at that crossover point, if the speaker isn't designed very well, you could be missing frequencies, or you can be having, you know, if it overlaps the wrong way, you can actually be having frequencies boosted at that crossover point. Okay, so as you can see right here,